I'm going to talk to you about the thrilling topic of tax breaks and grants. So I'm going to cover VGTR, VGTR loans, SEIS, EIS, and grants all in 15 minutes. So it's going to be very much a kind of 101. So if anyone wants to talk in more detail later, just grab me. Just a bit of background about me. I'm a developer, originally a programmer, been running my own studios for the last 10 years, but in the last 3 or 4 years, I've also been consulting a lot with funds and with developers, primarily around access to finance. And one of my roles is providing loans against tax relief. So I've spent quite a lot of time in this area and have seen quite a lot of claims. So hoping, I mean, how many people here have claimed it or are claiming VGTR? Is that it? Anyone? Who's a developer? Okay, and you guys haven't claimed it yet? Okay, right. Okay, so just a bit of basics about what it is then. The only things that are excluded are games for advertising, promotion and gambling. At least 25% of your costs must be incurred within Europe, essentially. And very importantly, the claim must be made by the company responsible for the design, development and testing of the game. And obviously it has to be companies that are subject to UK corporation tax. So what do you get? You get 20% of qualifying costs. It's actually calculated as 25% of 80%, but effectively, to keep it simple, it's 20%. It's either paid against losses, which is what most developers do, or it can be offset against your taxes. Subcontractor costs are fine, so some companies who are using subcontractors, that's not a problem, but there is a limit of £1 million you can claim against that. You can claim before the game is released. In fact, you still get the money if the game isn't released, as long as you've actually spent the money on developing it, but you have to have the intent of releasing it. And obviously you can carry on claiming after the game is released if there's ongoing development. So just kind of the way it works, you go to the BFI website, you complete the cultural test. Initially, when the tax relief came out, there was quite a lot of worry about the cultural test, I think simply because it's called a cultural test, but actually it's pretty difficult to fail. I'm sure there are cases that have, but when I asked the BFI, they said they didn't know of any that had failed, and it would be extremely difficult to do so. So you're basically going to pass if you're a UK company. You can then apply for a letter of comfort. I've never seen anyone do this, but the basis is there to enable you to use that to make investors more comfortable that you're going to be able to claim. Once you've actually spent some money, you can then apply for an interim certificate, make some of your game, and make a claim. You can make claims as often as you want. There's no minimum or maximum amount to claim. You could claim it every week if you wanted to, but the reality is there's a cost attached with claiming. Most people tend to claim with their end-of-year accounts because your accountant can do it all as one, and then the cost is pretty much lowered. I know some companies I've seen who are claiming quarterly, simply because it helps with cash flow, but I think you've got to be claiming enough to make that worthwhile, because it's going to cost you a couple of grand for your accountant to actually sort it out. So most efficient way is to do it once a year. Making a claim itself is pretty simple. It goes to HMRC. Your accountant should do it. The thing I would say is, and I've seen a lot of these, and I can tell you this is, I can't stress this enough, use an accountant who has done a VGTR claim before. Do not listen if accountants say, oh, I've done an R&D claim. That's the same thing. It is not. It is very different. I've seen a lot of problems come up with this. And what tends to happen is that they don't submit the right information. It gets held up for months, and the developer doesn't get their money for a long time. So it's worth finding somebody specialist. Your normal accountant can still do your end-of-year accounts. Find someone else to do the VGTR. You keep doing these claims whilst you make the game. There's this idea of a final certificate, which is what you're supposed to do when the game is complete. But this was taken from the film model, and I'm not sure how many games are ever complete these days. So I know plenty of projects where they've never actually claimed a final certificate because there's still ongoing development. So I haven't ever quite got clarity from the BFI about what the lines are on this, but the definitions do say that you can continue using interim certificates as long as you're still developing. So it's a bit of a grey area. The problem is if you apply for a final certificate and then want to claim against further ongoing costs, you've got to go back through the whole process, go to the BFI, get a new cultural certificate, blah, blah, blah. So you want to avoid doing that until you really have to. And some people don't do it at all. I'm not sure how the HMRC feel about that though. So tax relief loans. So the idea here is because this is money claimed back in arrears, it doesn't really help with cash flow. So this has been happening in the film industry for a long time, and it's become more popular in our industry now. So basically, you can get a loan in advance against the tax relief that you're going to claim. It can be given before you spend any money, but you do have to have the financing in place because it's essentially a bridging loan, so it's fairly low risk. That's generally, because I run one of these loan funds, that's generally the problem that we come up against. Developers come to us thinking that we can provide them money before they've got any of the finance. Now though, as in film, the loans are often used as part of a funding round. So either the developer will use the VGTR as collateral for an investor. So if an investor's giving you 500 grand, you can say to them, well, I can guarantee 100 grand of that back once I make my claim. Or you get the money, you get a loan in principle in advance and then say to the investor, well, I need 500 grand, but actually I've already got 100 grand of it, I only need 400 from you. And quite a lot of developers now have worked this out and are actually writing that into their normal processes. And some of the funds, Altara, Headgear, and there's a few others as well that do this now. It's not the cheapest money because it's a bridging loan, but it can be really good to help with cash flow. Does everyone know what SEIS and EIS is? Anyone not know? Okay, so this is a government incentive, so Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme and Enterprise Investment Scheme. So this is essentially tax relief for investors. So from a developer point of view, you're not going to get anything, but what you are going to get is investors who are more likely to give you money. And it really has encouraged significant investments into startups and small companies over the last few years, well, quite a while now that it's been running. And it, particularly for the games industry, which is a very high-risk area, we've seen a lot more investment into startups because of this scheme. So essentially, you can claim SEIS if you're up to 2 years old. You have to be trading for 4 months. You can take, through the scheme, you can take a maximum of £150,000 investment. You can take more, but you can only claim the tax benefits off that. And you have to have fewer than 25 employees. The important bit is that for an investor, they can offset 50% of their investment against income tax, and any money they make is exempt from capital gains. All of that applies even if you lose their money. So they are actually risking a lot less than they're giving you, which is why it's become a very popular way for people to invest. EIS is the same, but with slightly less incentives because it's bigger amounts of money. So they can invest a huge amount more, but rather than 50%, they'll get 30%. And most companies, what they do is they use SEIS for the first bit, then use EIS for the next bit. You can get an advanced assurance from HMRC to confirm that you will be eligible for it. If you are looking to raise funding from private investors, it may well be worth just getting the advanced assurance. It's pretty easy to do. And it just means that when you're talking to an investor, you can say, yeah, we can claim SEIS, yeah, we can claim EIS. And it will help them, it will make their lives easier. I would say that if you are going to go down this route, it's really good. I've done it several times myself. But there are quite a lot of requirements and restrictions. You need to be very careful. There are certain things in how the investor gives you the money that you've got to be very careful with. They're all pretty reasonable, in my opinion, but how they get their money back, what types of shares are issued, there are restrictions. So you need to be careful. You need to get your shareholders' agreement right. Otherwise, you could go to make the claim and they can't get the money. It's one of those things, it's pretty good, but you probably want somebody who knows what they're doing to help you with the shareholders' agreement to make sure it's in place. And you can then submit your shareholders' agreement to HMRC in advance, do another advanced approval, and actually get them to approve the shareholders' agreement at that point, which is probably worth doing, just for peace of mind, if nothing else. So, different grants. So, there's quite a lot of public pots of money out there. The amounts of money they each have available varies in terms of the overall pot and in terms of how much they'll give per project. But there's never enough support, and developers always want more, which is understandable, in particular because there's not actually that many funds that fund content. So there's quite a lot of grants of varying sizes that are available for, well, has been in the past for training, for export, for technology development, for innovation. But actually the number that's available for content is pretty limited, and that's what most developers want. Organisations like UKI are constantly pushing the government for more. In the recent budget, there was a small amount more given to the UK Games Fund, but it's a constant struggle, and particularly at the moment, with the way the government's approaching things, there isn't really much money going round. In fact, the answer seems to be, well, if we give you money, we have to take it from somewhere else. So what is out there? So the UK Games Fund is probably the most popular. The reason for that is that it's small grants, but the important thing is it's for prototypes. There's not many funds out there that will fund a project when there isn't something to already see. So they will give you, it's only 25 grand, but they will give you that money from day one for a prototype. And importantly, and again, very unusually, it's not match funded. So most funds, even content ones, require, they'll give you 25 grand, you have to find another 25 grand elsewhere. And often you have to do that in advance. The UK Games Fund does not require that, which is why it's so popular and oversubscribed. So it's a great, they tend to open the rounds I think once or twice a year. It's really good, but the amount of applications they get to the amount of grants they can give is insane. They're constantly pushing for more money. They have got a bit more, as I said, but it's very competitive. What I'd like to see is the same sort of thing, but bigger amounts of money and more of it. Creative England is the other one that people talk about a lot. Creative England has various different funds. At the moment, they've got one called Green Shoots. They have various different things. They can either be grants or loans, depending on the type of fund they have open at the time. But I've never seen one that isn't match funded. So you've got to provide at least 50% of the match when you go for the grant or the loan, which can be really tough, and they do have a lot of restrictions on them. So I'm not sure if it's still the case now, but certainly until a couple of years ago, for every 7 or 8 grand they gave you, they expected you to promise one new employee, which is pretty tough. Now, how much they vet that, I don't know, but it's pretty tough restrictions, whereas the UK Games Fund doesn't tend to have those kind of things. Then you've got other grants for content. So you've got Creative Europe, which is quite an interesting one. It specifically provides grants for narrative-based games. Slightly more money generally, but it only opens occasionally. And their requirements for who can apply are pretty stringent. But they did fund, for example, the Chinese Room. So they have done some good projects. And then if we look outside of content, you've got technology funding. So in particular, Innovate UK and Horizon 2020. So Horizon 2020 is the Creative Europe stuff, so that's EU. Innovate UK is within the UK. Essentially, these will fund projects that are technical innovations. So games companies do get funding through this, but you can't just be making a game. You've got to be doing something that is innovative within the space. So making a new games engine, making something that, and it's got to be something that can be beneficial to the industry and not just to you. So it's something you can use, but you've got to have the intent to then provide it to the rest of the industry. So I've seen people get Innovate UK funding for Unity plugins that do something clever, an algorithm or something like that other people can then use. Horizon 2020 is kind of, if you've gone through Innovate UK, you could potentially apply to that. It's much bigger amounts of money, in the millions. It's pretty tough. The application process is, if I was to say arduous, that would be an understatement. I've never seen anything like it. It's like all the nightmares that people think about grant funding in one application form, and it takes about 8 months to get your money, if you do get it. But it is large amounts of money, so if you're at that stage, it's worth it. But you've got to really be pretty advanced. You've got to have something that's going to scale a lot, and it's got to be technically innovative. So again, there are a few games companies that have had it, but you tend to be talking the larger companies and more established ones. And then you've got regional funds. So I think these are going to play more and more of an important role. I think the way the government at the moment is approaching all this stuff is to really try and give things to local areas rather than to kind of, provide something that caters for the whole industry across the UK. So what we're going to see more and more of, and this is what, UK's been doing, is try to find pots of money in each local area that can then be used in ways to help our industry. So UK's done a thing up at the moment around Warwick. If you're in that area, there's funding available. And it's a bit more complicated because you've got to pull bits from here and there. But, hopefully organisations like UK can help us to do that. But my feeling is that particularly, Wales, Scotland, Yorkshire and the North East at the moment have got various pots that are good for games industry. The South West did for quite a while. It's not as good now, but it tends to come and go as it does. But I would say that, you know, if you're outside of the Greater London area, there's probably some funding available from your local areas. Unfortunately, if you're in Greater London, there tends to be less because you don't come under the criteria for the EU funding. And then the final one I'd like to mention is DIT, which is previously UKTI. These are the guys responsible for export. So they give very small amounts of money, but you can get funding for things like going to GDC. If you're a small company or a startup, can make a lot of difference. So, you know, I've got a grant of £1,000 this year to go to GDC, which covers, you know, most of my travel and accommodation. And, you know, when those things start to add up, it really makes a difference. They can also, I've never used it, but I think they can also fund things like web development if you're making the your website with different languages and things like that. So there's quite a lot that they can do. As I said, it's small amounts of money, but it can really add up and can really help. So I think, you know, in general, you know, you're not going to go and get one pot of money, whether it's private or public, to fund your game or your company. You know, it's a journey, and you're going to be grabbing different bits of money from different places. Some of them may seem very small, but, you know, if you can get a grant to go to GDC, which then helps you get a publisher who can then help you fund something else, that's the way this works. It's an ongoing thing. And if anything, I think the way that all this is going, that's just going to become more and more the case. So it can feel like a minefield, and there is, you know, so many options that you could probably have a full-time job just trying to work it all out. But, you know, hopefully talks like this will help, and just networking, getting to know what's out there is really important. So just some tips. How much do I have time? Okay, VGTR is a no-brainer. If you're not doing it, you should be. There's just no other way about it. There is no lower limit. You could be making a game for £10,000, you could still claim it, and you may as well. If you're trying to raise private investment, or you're considering it, consider getting your advance assurance from HMRC for SEIS and EIS. It's one form, takes about 6 weeks, I think, for them to reply. It's pretty straightforward, and frankly, if an investor turns around to you and says, oh, have you got it, it's much easier just to be able to say yes. And also, you look like you know what you're talking about, which is going to help. You could spend your whole life applying for grants, literally, so be careful. My advice would be, don't try and crowbar a project into a grant. Only go for a grant if you really know that it's a fit, because frankly, they're going to know that you're trying to kind of get in around the back door, and it's not going to work. So really be careful what you apply for, and don't make the mistake of starting to rely on grants. Grants are there, and public funding is there to fill gaps that private funding won't. So, you know, use it where it's appropriate, but don't make the mistake of kind of relying on them and going from one pot of money to the other for a few years, because it's just not a sustainable way to run a business. And you've got to understand why these funds exist. They exist to grow the UK economy and create jobs, right? They're not there to fund your game. That might be what they're doing, but they're doing it to grow the economy and to create jobs. So when you get frustrated about why they're asking silly questions or why they've got silly restrictions, try and think about what it is that these people need to achieve and what boxes they've got to tick, because that will help you understand it and help you to be successful with the funding. And then, yeah, funding is a journey. You need to understand the landscape. It's an ongoing thing. You're never going to know everything, but you need to work out what's going to work for you at what time, and try, and this is the hard bit, try not to get some funding at the beginning that's going to stop you getting some other funding later. And that's very difficult to do, but trying to understand the landscape will help. So we, a few months ago, released a financer database. So it's a directory of all of the finances that we're aware of that are relevant to UK companies. We're constantly updating it. I'm constantly finding new ones. But if you go onto that URL, there you can search by type of funder, so public money, VCs, angels, publishers, and so on. So hopefully that will help you to make a start. That's it. Are there any questions? No? Cool. Thank you very much.